I try to do a bit of jargon busting in these chats. There's so much jargon that writers use, and I think it makes writing appear more difficult than it really is. One that confused me for ages was the word conflict. So that's what I'm chatting about today. Writers often get the advice that the key to successful storytelling is creating conflict. And I thought this meant filling your story with disagreements and fights and arguments. I can see how conflict will make your story exciting and give you great action points. But I thought, well, I don't want there to be a fight or an argument all the time. What about build-up? What about intrigue? What about character? So I was confused that you seem to get this message of how crucial it is to establish the conflict as soon as you can, as soon after you introduce your main character as possible, because I thought this meant that you have to move quickly to a big piece of action as soon as you can, and I did struggle with this. It took me a while to understand why everyone goes on about why conflict is so important, and I think it's because when writers talk about conflict, they are using a really loaded word. Conflict means a lot of things. It's often defined as being a struggle between two opposing forces, and I think struggle is a great word as a great starting point for understanding conflict in stories. So a story is basically defined as establishing what a character wants to change about their life and what's stopping them changing and how they overcome it. Stories are often about a struggle to overcome obstacles, finding and killing a wolf or rescuing from a tower. That's the kind of the big picture, but writers are given the advice they need to understand conflict in every scene, not just the big central conflict. And I was like, every scene? Is there a struggle in every scene? And that's when I think I realised that I was probably missing the point about what writers are talking about when they talk about conflict. So I think conflict can be used to describe anything that's stopping your character achieving their goal. So conflict is about the obstacles a character needs to overcome. And I think it took me a while to realise that sometimes obstacles are not what you think they are. When I think of obstacles, I tend to think of something that you know about, something you're aware of that's getting in the way of a goal. If you want to eat an apple on the other side of a wall, it's pretty obvious that the wall is an obstacle. But is it the only point of conflict? Probably not. What else might be stopping you? Maybe a lack of dynamite to blow up the wall, and maybe a lack of ability to climb the wall, a fear of heights, fear because a story you heard that what is really on the other side of the wall is not a tasty apple, but a monster. All of that might be stopping you. All of that could be conflict that you could use to crank up the tension in that particular scene. And that's when I started to understand conflict, because I started to think of scenes in terms of tension. I found it easier to ask myself all the possible places or things where tension in a scene might be coming from. So let's say you climb this wall and there's now a hungry monster standing in front of you. So the next piece of conflict is that the monster is now going to get in your way of your wish to stay alive. That's pretty obvious conflict. So what other obstacles or tension might you bring in? How about that your character left their sword by their bed that morning? Yep, forgetting the sword, that's a bit of tension. That counts as conflict. So why did they leave behind the sword? Let's go back in the story. Let's think about this small non-action packed scene where someone gets out of bed and forgets something. Where's the conflict in that rather unimportant, unexciting scene? Is there conflict? I think this is where it really helps every scene for an author to know the point of conflict in every scene. If you want every scene to be important, this is where you've got to help your reader to understand. You've got to set up what's important in that scene. What is the conflict? So in this case, it might be your character's forgetfulness. If you haven't established that the main character's forgetful, and at some point that's going to be really crucial to the story and to the action and the tension, go back and put it in. And that's when you can start to really crank up the tension once you've identified what all the points of conflict are. You need to let the reader see inside and see a character's flaws, and that's a great way of building up conflict. So maybe she doesn't have her sword because someone tricked her and told her there wasn't really a monster on the other side of the wall. So she's also in conflict now with the person who tricked her. Was that character pretending to offer good advice? Is she now wondering if that person is really a trusted friend? That's another thing that's messing with her head and maybe preventing her from successfully fighting the monster. It's something that you can make a deal of in the story. Why has she been tricked? Who are the people she's put her trust in? Has she been listening to stories in the world around her that whisper the monster is unbeatable? That's particular kind of conflict is conflict with your environment. So conflict with what you believe of yourself and the reality of who you are, who you want to be, conflict with friends, conflict with the world around you, conflict with people who maybe have got hidden different goals to you. These are all the sorts of things writers are talking about when they use that word conflict. Character flaws I think of as a particular kind of conflict, and I like to think of this as being wrestling with your thoughts or wrestling with yourself. I think wrestling with yourself is a powerful point of conflict, and it can be described as part of your character's personality trait. We love reading about characters who struggle with their own personalities and their own flaws, wanting to be better versions of themselves, but they find it hard work. So there is a particular piece of jargon that describes this personality wrestling, and it's called internal conflict. So when you're trying to identify conflict in a scene to work out what's important, don't neglect internal conflict. Let's take our monster story a little bit further. So we get to the big scene. The thing you've been building to in your story happens. Your main character finally meets the monster. And here you can probably identify all sorts of points of tension. If you can identify them all, you can work to make that scene even more tense and work to make the scenes that build up to it even more tense, even more exciting and more meaningful. That's how you make a story more powerful. Very often, the biggest obstacles to our succeeding are our own inner voices reminding us of our weaknesses and our doubts. So what you're trying to do all the time in your story is build tension, and also you do this by building understanding of your character. Building understanding of all the struggles they are facing and their worries. These worries are going to be happening where your reader won't see them from the outside. So I think that sometimes the most effective points of conflict are the ones that are unseen. And these are difficult to understand as a reader and difficult to get across as a writer, but worth it. Your job as a writer is to get your reader to understand your main character, understand the points of conflict, especially the hidden ones, the ones that go on inside our heads. Inner conflict can be so effective in a story, even if it's more tricky to write, and that's why people tell you mastering conflict is a good step towards mastering good storytelling. This is why writers get told you need conflict to propel a narrative forward. The absence of conflict means there's little story that we care about. It's why you need to understand conflict. Conflict really isn't just big fights or obvious arguments. It's much more important than that. It's where writers create characters that feel real and makes readers care about their struggles.